Good afternoon, all. Thank you for accommodating me virtually. I'm sorry I could not be with you in person today. My name is Jatin, Garich, and today I'll just be giving you a brief overview of the modeling policies for the IFRS digital taxonomies. So, as a first step, it's probably important to start with um, why. So, why have we developed these modeling policies? What is the reason for it? And ultimately, it's because we've come to realize that the XBRL standard sort of supports a lot of different approaches to data modeling. A single, disclosure or data point could be modeled in a variety of different ways, and so there's reasonable approaches that different entities might take. And indeed, within a single taxonomy, there might be conflicting choices that might lead to confusion for reporters and users of that tagged information. So there is a need for consistency on how we approach our data modeling across our projects, as well as over time, especially considering we now have an IFRS accounting taxonomy, as well as an IFRS sustainability disclosure taxonomy. So these policies are developed and maintained and certainly updated as the XBRL standard is developed and updated. So our overall modeling approach. We have a vision to achieve decision useful, high quality, and globally comparable accessible digital financial reports. And so to achieve this vision, we believe that our IFRS digital taxonomies should, at a minimum, reflect all presentation and disclosure requirements in the IFRS standards, and do that in a manner that maximizes the benefits of useful digital financial information, while also being cognizant of the informational needs of users and then the costs to preparers of tagging that information. So it's a layered approach to our overall modeling approach, which starts with the presentation and disclosure requirements, and then using the variety of approaches one could take to model those requirements in a manner that maximizes the benefits for users. So looking at the types of information that we model in the IFRS digital taxonomies, and this is at a very high level, we have numerical information and narrative information. And so those two are usually the types of information that are quite often explicit in the requirements. So numerical information would be things like your discrete data points, so profit or loss, or if you're looking at the IFRS sustainability disclosure taxonomy, your greenhouse gas emissions. These pieces of information are easier to directly compare between entities and across time, and inherently provide a greater opportunity to create structure with which the data can be analyzed. Narrative information, on the other hand, that could encapsulate larger chunks of information or potentially smaller, shorter textual explanations. Narrative information is often broader and is often analyzed at a less granular context. However, that being said, we do also consider categorical disclosures, which can almost provide a summary to narrative informations. And that's where we would consider elements such as the Boolean elements or extensible enumerations. And then the other type of information that we model is what we call relational or structural information. Oftentimes, but not always, these links or structures or relationships could be implicit. So it's trying to model the mechanisms for connecting and linking concepts in the IFRS digital taxonomies. In my view, this type of information is incredibly important, especially when we consider a digital financial report, because if one were to read a paper-based financial report, one could make those links simply by reading the report, inferring where one data piece sits in relation to another data piece, and sort of getting that context. Whereas in a digital report, we sometimes need to make those implicit links explicit. So those relational or structural information is, how do concepts relate to each other, considering what might be, say, presented in the face of the primary financial statements versus disclosed in the notes, how concepts may be disaggregated, whether there are any mathematical or hierarchical roll-ups of those concepts, In the next few slides, what I'd like to do is just, again, at a high level, just talk through key principles that we consider when modeling each of these types of information. So for numerical information, as I mentioned earlier, they allow users to compare and analyze data in an efficient manner. And oftentimes these data points is what users would import directly into their models. And so the key data characteristic we're looking for here is comparability. So we would create distinct separate elements for distinct items of numerical information that are expected to be presented or disclosed separately. And then looking specifically at the IFRS accounting taxonomy, a key factor that we try and represent in our taxonomy is creating the link between concepts that might be presented in the primary financial statements, bearing in mind that the primary financial statements communicate a useful structured summary of the entity's financial performance and position, and then linking that with the note disclosures and the information in the note disclosures, which would then provide further information and context to facilitate the understandability of that information. So that link becomes important in a digital financial report. Looking at narrative information, so generally we found that users analyze narrative information and numerical information differently. So whereas numerical information often is analyzed at a granular level, narrative information often depends on the context and can be less directly comparable than numerical information. So our approach to modeling narrative information is that separate elements should be created for requirements that are expected to be separately understandable to users of general purpose financial reports, as well as readily identifiable for tagging. And taking into account those two criteria, we would model separate narrative elements at the most granular level at which both requirements are met. And the thought process here is to consider what level of information or how much of detail of information and surrounding context would a user need to consider that piece or block of information useful. And as mentioned earlier, we also consider categorical elements for any disclosure requirements that could be addressed in a categorical format. So that is either as a true-false format or from a list of possible options. And where narrative information is not necessarily directly comparable between entities, categorical disclosures can add a little bit of comparability to that scenario and provide almost a starting point when analyzing narrative information. And lastly, just looking at relational or structural information. So the key characteristic we're trying to achieve here is the understandability of the digital financial reports. So the relational information would express the link or the connection or the relationship between pieces of numeric and narrative information. Some of the relationships we reflect in the IFRS digital taxonomies include the relationships of concepts between different standards, different IFRS standards, connecting concepts between the primary financial statements and the notes, as we've discussed, and then looking at how concepts can be disaggregated by means of a dimension, for example, or looking at how numerical items could relate to each other mathematically or arithmetically using calculation relationships. These are some of the relationships we try to communicate in our IFRS digital taxonomies. So this has been a high-level overview of our modeling approach. And as always, we entertain and would love to entertain any further discussion and thoughts on these. But for now, I will hand over. I think it's back to John.
I think we can go straight to your slides, David. If I think there's a clicker up here. I can give you the clicker if that's easier, or you can.
Sure.
But your slides will come up in just a second.
I'll stand up while I do that, but I'll make sure I don't have feedback coming from there. Okay. Oh, here we go. And so I'm going to set the table for the rest of our discussion this afternoon. And I think there's a lot of similarities with what we're laying out with our design principles versus what the IASB has. I do think we have some slightly nuanced differences, and in certain ways, I think we, approach it slightly differently, but, very much along the same path. And so I just want to highlight what we have laid out for ours. And but before that, the first is the why. Why are we doing this? And so our objective in defining and promulgating our design principles is that it informs the team that's responsible for developing the taxonomy, so that they know how to approach a new disclosure requirement coming from an accounting standards update. It also informs our constituency that uses the taxonomy, and this would be the full realm of the preparers and the data users, the regulators, and any other parties wanting to use our taxonomy. And not in the slides, but it also gives us a level of accountability that when we're designing it, we should really stick to these principles so as to make sure that we have a consistently modeled taxonomy across the various topics that require disclosures. And so this slide is the high level of what we see as the four core principles. And I'm just going to run through them rather quickly, just so we can get on to the discussion. First up is to maintain the taxonomy current with US GAAP and certain SEC reporting requirements related to GAAP and common reporting practice. And so, and this is, the taxonomy has to fit its design use. If filers cannot use it to make their disclosures adequately, then it's failed what it was designed for. The second is just ensuring that the taxonomy complies and keeps current with the technology used for business requirements. And this is really pushing that we want to stay in times with the technology so that we are best optimizing the taxonomy for use. And so anything along the lines of adopting new standards that come from XBRL International, like Extensible Enumerations 2.0, and using the latest version of the Data Types Registry, and just even making sure we're just using the best applicable structures that XBRL allows to convey that information, such as type dimensions when they are appropriate. And then those two are relatively straightforward. The latter two, I'm going to go into a little more detail on the following slides because there is a little bit more involved with those. So first up is structuring the reporting requirements consistently for primary elements and dimensional structures, which I'll get into more. And then include taxonomy features that facilitate high quality use of the taxonomy by all our constituents. And so getting into the details on that. And so with this, we're saying that we want to ensure that the primary elements, the ones that are used to report a fact against, are like the ones that are rooted in the accounting concepts of the US GAAP codification. And so anything where the underlying recognition measurement is a GAAP requirement, we want to have that reflected within the primary concepts. And for the other side of that, dimensions are predominantly used to represent things that are classes, objects, or items that don't necessarily are defined in accounting, but have broader meaning. And just taking this a little more deeper dive. So when we say that with the elements, the primary elements that they're coming from the GAAP requirements, we have other aspects of how we model them. And so I have listed out guidance that we currently have on our site, which is anyone is free to access and read. But we've put out guidance on assisting our taxonomy team members with picking the appropriate period type for the element, debit or credit, which modeling perspective you should choose. How to structure and write labels, what information should be included within those, and also guidance on providing references to the codification in there. The data types is, there's no link, and it says TBD because we haven't yet defined that. But just kind of getting back to what Jatin was saying as far as, the narrative disclosures and the numeric and that, those are disclosure requirements that sometimes require narrative information to be disclosed. And so we make sure that going back to the first principle, that, we do include elements in the taxonomy to meet those disclosure requirements. Next up, a little more deep dive on the dimensional modeling and this idea that it should really represent classes, types, objects. So using dimensions the primary purpose of using dimensions is to disaggregate balances across a set of class, like types of intangible assets, segments, and that sort of thing. And so the idea that a building has meaning beyond, what accountants view and measure a building one way versus the way someone else, like an architect or a fire marshal, would. And so existing guidance documents that we have on our website we have our dimension uses guide, which gets in the idea of, when to, for disaggregation. And then we do have a couple other nuanced ways, and so that document describes it. And then a different document that gets into distinct domains versus hierarchies. So when you should build a hierarchy versus when we should use discrete dimensions for that information. And so lastly, the last deep dive is the fourth principle, which is that we want to ensure we include taxonomy features that facilitate high use of the taxonomy by all our constituents. And that's everything that we do as far as including the relationships, providing the calculations that show the numerically how they relate to each other, structuring the presentation so that elements are easily discoverable by the users, providing change notes which highlight what has been added, what has been deprecated, if we've modified the references, and that sort of information. The taxonomy implementation notes is a means of conveying additional guidance to the users of the taxonomy that's embedded right directly in the taxonomy for optimal use. And then last two other things important to highlight is the DQCRT, which is an XBRL representation of the data quality rules that's done by XBRL US. And our most recent big addition is the meta model, which, well, I have a slide that I'll cover on the next, get in that a little more detail on the next slide. And then last, as far as guidance topics we have out there existing is on our taxonomy implementation notes. There's a document on our website that goes into more detail on that. And so just this slide, what is the meta model? It's to provide more expressive relationships. A lot of the traditional relationships in XBRL, like the presentation and calculation, are really based on particular presentations, how financial statements are structured, and not necessarily how the accounting information relates up to each other. And so that includes these accounting relevant relationships that I've kind of bucketed up on this slide to show how they, instant accrual and instant contra, they relate together to provide a better accounting semantic view of how the information relates together. And this we're doing to help assist preparers in selecting the correct element when they're tagging. It also is very helpful in writing business rules and is actually starting to be leveraged by the data quality rules in their validations. And my shameless plug is tomorrow afternoon, Campbell Pride and I will be doing a session on the meta model. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, please join that session. And that's all I have, John, for the presented part. Forward.
Thank you very much, David, and to Jatin. Those are both very helpful ways to open up this discussion. So let's start with a cheeky question. How come you're doing this? Isn't this something that XBRL International should be doing? Why are you creating your own principles? Why is it different? Who wants to start? Lewis, you're closest.
I'm closest, so I'll go first. So I just want to start by saying, Jatin, I'm really envious of your God seat, but just don't do anything behind us that we might not appreciate. So the reason, it's not in conflict with XBRL International is building on the principles that XBRL International has put forth. Every territory has their own particular requirements that are set by the regulators and policymakers. And at the end of the day, we need to comply with those, and we need to figure out what works best for us. And as David indicated in his slide, we've had all of these design principles that have evolved over 15 years now plus, and they've been on pieces of napkins, scattered about the office, metaphorically speaking, of course. And we realized we need to pull that together for our team so that everybody on the team understands, not just intuitively, because we talk about it all the time, but they understand that this is really core to how we build it out. One of the things with our team is that, we have a dozen individuals, and it's a very, what I call a self-service structure, meaning that everybody is responsible for their topic. They don't hand it off to a technologist to model the taxonomy. Our subject matter experts do the modeling. So they need to understand these concepts and these principles. So that's the paramount reason we do it. But at the same time, we believe in being transparent and soliciting input from our constituent. And so as we craft these things, we solicit input. We want to make sure that they understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to make sure they agree with what we're doing. Sometimes they'll come back and say, we don't think that's really a good idea, or maybe you should enhance it with this. And then finally, I think this kind of discussion, this forum, with other taxonomy architects and others in our space is really important to helping us all be better at what we're doing, and as well as being consistent in what we're doing. So that's, at the end of the day, that's why we're doing it.
Thank you. Owen, let's bring you into the conversation. Do you want to add to that? You've got some interesting challenges because you don't have one set of constituents. You've got 140.
Yeah, so that makes some differences. It makes some differences to our standards in that they're quite principles-based and they're applied across a lot of different jurisdictions. It makes a big difference to our interaction with those regulators because we have a lot of different regulators that we interact with. So it puts a bit more pressure on us to be, I think, consistent in the way we do things and to justify and explain why we make certain decisions. And what we noticed over the last few years, partly because we were getting new team members in who were kind of being trained up, was we were having a lot of the same conversations over and over again. Hopefully we were coming to the same answers, but it just gets to that point where you think, no, what we really need to do is to document this, partly to bring team members up, partly so that we can expose those to other people and say, this is why, and partly so that when we write and expose modelling decisions we've made, we can focus on those areas where we did something interesting, rather than going over the sort of standard set of assumptions that we would always make, and to distinguish those two so that people's review time is focused on the interesting areas, the areas where they can add value and provide kind of feedback, and it's clear to people, we can just say, okay, well, we did this the way we always do this, see policy X, and that's not sort of the interesting part. And as Lewis said, for all the same reasons, to get that kind of feedback from the community, are you doing things the best way you could be, have those conversations, and ensure we're consistent.
Yeah, and if I can just add to
please.
that, I mean, we constantly compare notes with what the IASB is doing. Right. And so we've got our design principles, you've got yours, and I always say I learned from the diff analysis, right? So what's different? And it's like, oh, that's a good idea, and we can pick that up.
Yep.
And sometimes it's good ideas that you can copy from each other.
Yep.
Sometimes there's areas where it's better to be consistent than to be different for no good reason. And sometimes there are, because we said we are in different, you've got particular regulatory requirements, we have a slightly different environment, there are justifiable reasons to be slightly different. But as long as those are conscious decisions that you've reasoned your way through, rather than got to by accident because two modelers put in the room coming up with a model for one set of standards will probably produce three models, Right.
So having a set of standard operating procedures
is
for
always
your
a good idea.
environment helps in a whole range of contexts, not least the fact that you've got, it's more than just the people on the stage that are doing this work. In terms of either operational or strategic priorities, are there examples of this process that impacts influence the choices that you make? I don't know, do you want to have a go at that one, David? Or who would like to put their hands up to that one?
Do you want to? I can. Yeah. So we do have 15 years of data which helps inform our modeling decisions and what we've learned from how the taxonomy was built. And it's important to remember that the taxonomy was built without anyone actually using it. And so what was thought of as a good idea at the time may not necessarily have been that, and so we learned from that. And so our design principles are coming from a lengthy experience of having the taxonomy applied in the wild.
Yeah, I mean, just one example. When the US GAAP taxonomy was first built, it had no dimensions in it. It was early days, right? It was before it went public. And at some point, we decided it needed to have dimensions. The first use case was statement of shareholders' equity, which is probably the worst place for it. Legacy problem, right? Yep. And then we included it, and everybody was concerned that preparers would know what to do with it. And so for the first year or so, preparers struggled with it. And then they learned how to use it. And I'm sure the filing agents helped with that a great deal with the software. But they got super creative. And so now we've got disclosures with 9 dimensions in it. And now users are telling us they can't use this information. Right. And so that's the sort of evolution you have to go through, where you've got to rationalize some of those earlier ideas. And a lot of these are legacy issues that we're just going to have to live with. But
right.
we over time, we make changes.
Have you got anything from the IFRS side that you want to bring in, Jatin?
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm just thinking, listening to the discussion and thinking about it. I guess if you think about IFRS accounting standards, they're very much principles-based. So there are scenarios where disclosure requirements can be applied in many different ways by entities and still achieve this disclosure objective. And so our approach then is informed almost by, well, what is the most robust approach we can take to cater to entities applying disclosure requirements in different ways, still achieving the disclosure requirement, as well as then looking across jurisdictions and how those disclosure requirements might look across jurisdictions. Owen, I'm not sure if you want to add anything.
And as you alluded to, John, obviously we've had a series of adoptions over different jurisdictions, and then you see slightly different usages, and then you revisit your taxonomy and go, oh, someone's using this in the way we weren't necessarily expecting. Are our design decisions still right in that context? You have new standards come through, and every new standard has a slightly new disclosure, and you hope that the principles you've got just work, and sometimes they do, and sometimes you look at them and you go, yeah, this isn't possibly the best answer now. And as you said, the really big change recently we've seen is, of course, sustainability reporting, which is a very different beast, partly because of the stage that sustainability reporting at its name. There's not 75 years of history of how to do that. Partly because it's a bit, lots of people are introducing it at the same time. And of course, it's a very different data set. And one thing that was quite interesting was revisiting, from an accountant taxonomy perspective, that balance between numbers and narrative. Which one are the focus? Where is the data that people are interested in? It's a flippant thing to say, but it's not entirely untrue to say that for accountants, well, it's the numbers. And the narrative's kind of nice, but it's just the secondary thing. Or at least, and you can be sucked into thinking that way as a data modeler. From sustainability, you rapidly realize that a lot of the time, the narrative is the data. And so that gave us those kind of innovations, such as, well, actually, narrative is lovely, but it's in multiple languages. It involves all sorts of wonderful additional explanatory information, but actually, what was the answer to the question? You know, and I need to be able to filter people into groups based on their answers to these sort of fairly narrative questions. Well, if the standard gives you essentially say yes or no, or put yourself into one of these buckets, it seems reasonable then to ask people to boil their answer down to that in the data as well. So there's those kind of little innovations, and we then took that and looked back at the accounting and said, oh, well, we've got places where that's true there as well, and maybe we're not making the best use of the data people are providing.
So it's been very interesting to see the IFRS Foundation embrace those categoricals, recognizing that the very first thing that information providers tend to do is look at a piece of narrative and go, right, let's put a yes or a no answer to this question rather than have 9 paragraphs of dense text, and really you've embraced that. But that's not without controversy for your policymakers and adds a layer of complexity to your taxonomies. What's the status of the use of Booleans in the FASB framework? Because you've been doing that for some time,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, we've been using Booleans for quite a while, and added the extensible enumerations back.
Well,
It's
I
been a
want to
few
say like
years.
2018, 19, before when the enumerations 1.0 spec came out, we didn't adopt that, but we kind of did our custom type that was supposed to replicate what the ideas behind enumerations 2.0, which allowed for multiple values in that. And you know, Lewis talking about legacy, and then trying to reel back to my presentation on the design principles. We have been using fixed enumerations, and those date back, I think, pretty much to the beginning. But the guidance from XBRL International is that that's a legacy model, and extensible enumerations are much better. And so we have tried to move away from using those and just consistently using the extensible enumerations 2.0, since it does provide a better structure than what we get. So,
And a little history on how we got there. I go back to my comment about dimensions, cubes that had, 8, 9 different dimensions in it. And so we spent a lot of time talking to our constituents, and we even had XBRL International global participation in some of the discussion to figure out how to deal with this problem. And the end story was to only use dimensions in cubes that were disaggregating, or what Walter would call well-behaved dimensions, and to not use dimensions that were applying additional attributes, and to do that somewhere else. Well, we didn't have that somewhere else, but we figured it out with the extensible enumeration, and we used that to now separate dimensions that are being used for attributes and using the extensible enumerations for that. Our users haven't been complaining as much as they used to. I said it as they used to. But that was definitely an improvement, and that's what started us down that path. I do want to add one other thing about the Booleans and the extensible enumerations. And I believe the IASB is in a similar place in that we've started identifying items within our narrative. I like to call them narrative that lends itself to being quantified, right? So a Boolean is something that you can quantify. You can quantify it as true or false, or a fixed list. You can identify it on a list. And we're doing that specifically around accounting policies and accounting standard adoption, because one of the most common questions we get is, when was this standard implemented? Was it early adopted? Did they adopt it? When it's expected to be adopted? Just tell us when. We get this from the board. We get it from all sorts of people. And that's a hard question to answer because it's not required to be tagged. So we've included it in the taxonomy. We still don't have a requirement for it to be tagged, but we're hopeful that by leading on that front, we'll get there in time. But we're moving more and more in that kind of direction. And with the advent of these other taxonomies like sustainability and others, where this sort of information is explicitly being required, we're hoping that that will help, push this forward.
So that's a nice example of kind of a user-friendly addition to the taxonomies. But every issuer, every preparer has to come to grips with these taxonomies. Before lunch, we probably got an indication that maybe there's too much reliance on software vendors and consultants to help with that process. But really, we want management to be across these things. So what are the other user-centric aspects of your taxonomy design that you want to try and highlight that you've put some focus into? There's got different approaches to references. You've got a bunch of things. I don't know what you'd like to cover.
Who do you want to go first?
Who would like to go? Okay, Lewis, you just spoke. Let's go with you, Owen.
So,
okay.
some time ago, we had this idea in the beginning that a taxonomy would be self-documenting, that everything you need to know about the taxonomy was in the taxonomy. That idea does not work, right? Particularly if you have a dimensional structure. And it was at that point we decided we needed to start supplementing it with additional guidance, both internal and external. So within the taxonomy, we have TIN's taxonomy implementation notes, so those will be on individual elements. We have other guidance within the taxonomy along the same lines. And then there's a variety of other things that are built in that have been there since the beginning that are really important. And it's the linkage to the codification, our accounting standards codification. And that's probably the most important piece, because we've been trying to get our constituent to actually start using the taxonomy from the accounting standard perspective, which is to find the elements based on what the accounting standard tells you is the appropriate element, not vice versa. Think about how a preparer puts their financial statements together. They're starting from an accounting standard reporting requirement. They create their disclosure, and then we effectively tell them to go look over here in a taxonomy to find those elements. That's not how they work. They should be able to find the elements they need right there in the accounting standard. And that's what we've been doing. We've been spending a lot of effort to make sure that those are accurate. And if you go into our accounting standards today, you will find a list of those elements, and they can pick from those elements to apply for their tagging. That's an important piece of it. And then we supplement that with external guidance. We've got over 20 implementation guides now, I think.
I think so.
Some number like that.
Yeah.
And we typically issue those on new accounting standards.
Or remodeling, and just to add to that, we also have a couple of preparers guides on specific that aren't focused on a particular topic, but cover broad, I guess more broadly, like extensible enumerations to help the preparers and how to use those. So I kind of cut you off.
No, that's fine. And of course, we also have an online view of the taxonomy that refreshes continuously. So as we're developing the taxonomy throughout the year, any changes we make throughout the year are visible. They're not available to use directly, but they're visible so that anyone that's interested can see what we've changed from day to day as it updates.
Except it hasn't refreshed in a while, and I shut it down. Go ahead, Owen.
So we've, from the very beginning, we've kind of approached things from the standards driving the taxonomy side perspective, and really consider the taxonomy to be a standalone item or any form of kind of checklist or anything. So we've focused on that interconnection with the standards. So all of the elements have sort of references and explanations of how they connect and where they've been derived from the standards, or if they're disclosure or presentation requirements or have come out of common practice. And the important point then is we've used that to generate content in our online view of our standards, which again shows the standards and then the relevant elements that are related to that to sort of facilitate same kind of idea to facilitate that. I know what this number is as an accountant because it came from that standard. What's the appropriate element there? We then have documentation. We have guidance labels within the taxonomy to try and aid, as you say, calculations. quite a lot of consideration about which sort of, on the taxonomy side, what presentation grouping things should be put in to kind of aid people in finding them. We had just had a very long internal conversation about the philosophical location of elements between the primary P&L entry and the sort of subsidiary notes, or the bits that sort of halfway between. Now we've moved to IFRS 18, and sort of some subtlety as to where things should go has changed. So we're trying to support people in finding things where they expect to find them. And then, Jatin, would you like to discuss some of the materials we put out when we put up a taxonomy update?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Owen. Yes, so to facilitate that sort of understandability, especially of the changes to the taxonomy, and to reach almost a wider stakeholder group. So in addition to our taxonomy files, we have what we call IFRS Taxonomy Illustrated, or ITI, and that sort of takes a PDF format as well as an Excel format. And the purpose of the ITI is to show the taxonomy and its structure in a human readable format. So what you'll find is, if you take the PDF ITI, for example, you've got indents of child elements under parent elements, you've got an indication of where calculation relationships have been created, references to the underlying text. We also have a versioning report which helps our stakeholders understand what's changed from a previous version of the taxonomy. I think all of these are meant to sort of facilitate that, usability and understandability of what's changed, why has it changed, and sort of the reasons and decisions that underpin those changes.
And then
those are some of the changes in addition to Standards Navigator.
And then one more thing I'd mention is, of course, we have preparer guides and things like that. Our preparer guide is in need of a bit of an update, hasn't updated in a while, so we're in the process of doing an update to that. And as part of that, we're trying to bring together all of the sort of explanatory examples and materials that sort of indicate how one should do tagging from our various documents that we put out over the years, because we appreciate, we'll often, we'll put out a document called a taxonomy update to say these are the changes that are happening this year to the taxonomy, this is how you're supposed to use this, but we haven't actually collated those examples anywhere, and they're a little bit difficult to find at the moment. So that's one of the things we're going to try and do to help people find those examples of how to use the taxonomy.
But actually, all of those combined, all of those materials sound as though they should really help with enhancing comparability. We were a little bit shocked the other day when Revathi was preparing her presentation that was in the AI session just before lunch. Just a subset of ESEF disclosures surfaces 62 different ways of calculating gross profit, with all kinds of wild and woolly components that even the non-accountants are very clear shouldn't be part of gross profit. What should the software vendors, what should the accounting firms, what should issuers be, how should they be better at leveraging all those materials that you guys are putting a lot of effort into? Is this an education exercise? Is this something that needs to be baked into software? What do you think? Go on, Lewis.
I'm just waiting for a prompt. I think there's a couple of approaches. So I can say, was Revathi doing that against IASB data, or was it just?
Yeah, don't worry, it wasn't GAP data. It would never happen in GAP.
Yeah, I'm just
right.
I want to go back and do that test, because I wouldn't be at all surprised. We get some very interesting results, but there's two primary things I would focus on here. Is that the guidance that we publish, we know it's heavily used by the filing agents. And we know that because they call us up and ask us when the next one's going to come out. We also, we can see the data downloads off of our website, and we can see the level of usage. It's a rough indicator, but we know that it's being used. But the other piece that's really important is that we work very, very closely with the XBRL US Data Quality Committee. And I think everybody's probably heard about their work at this point. But they're very focused on creating validation rules, and those validation rules enforce these sort of things. So I don't know if there's one on gross profit. Maybe there should be. But it could check to see if there's an unusual pattern. But what we do specifically, there's two things we do specifically. We are including those rules. We go through our own acceptance process, but we're including those rules with the US GAAP taxonomy. And we are also providing input to the DQC on rules that we would hope they would implement that help with our new accounting standard implementation. So if we've got some modeling pattern that we've included in the taxonomy, we can include that in guidance, but it's reinforced if the DQC includes that as a rule that then ultimately gets adopted by the SEC via our inclusion in the taxonomy. And so that's really kind of how we've come to approach quote unquote enforcement, because we're not part of enforcement, we're a standard setter. But we can be supportive by what we do in the taxonomy.
Any thoughts from the IFRS side?
Well, I should say we are even less involved in reporting enforcement on that front. As we say, with having the variety of different regulators actually doing the collection on various different collection schemes. The one thing I must say, if you're talking about gross profit, because my boss will kill me if I don't mention it, on the IFRS side, is of course the upcoming IFRS 18 standard, which will actually provide a definition of operating profit and deal with hopefully quite a lot of these variations and complexities, which is something we've been putting a lot of time and effort into actually modelling on the taxonomy side recently, trying to work out ways to allow people to get the benefit of the objectives of the IFRS 18 standard, which is to allow a sort of a nice summary, careful categorization, well-defined operating profit, also providing information on management performance measures and various other useful bits and pieces. And it's what's been quite interesting from that front is actually the engagement of our board, which is probably a question you're going to come on to, talking about starting to really ask good questions about, okay, well, if we've got this standard that's designed to achieve this aim on paper to provide this information to analysts, how does that translate into the digital world? Does that carry across? Does the same kind of benefits accrue, or does something get lost in the translation? And that increased engagement is something we've really been happy about, really good. So we're trying to focus on things like making sure the modelling supports providing all the information that you'd need. As you say, there's also things like the DQC rules in the US. There's some sort of formula that are used on the ESEF side. Both of those, we're looking at what we can do to support or improve those.
Good. So we're going to run up against time as ever, but let me ask my last question for the moment, which is, I think one of the things that the XBRL standards don't do very well today is manage change. And I'm hopeful that some developments over the next 12, 18 months or so will improve that. But, tell us what are the things that you guys do to help issuers and their advisors understand what's changed in the taxonomy. Oh, this one's deprecated. And there's a timing question associated with those things. There's an application question associated with those things. But, managing change really should be the thing that's the top of mind for most environments on an ongoing basis, because they did the original hard work of tagging things. Now it's just understanding what's the delta. So what are some of your strategies there? Jatin, I'm going to pick on you.
Thanks, John. I think, so looking at how we manage sort of that change from our taxonomy perspective, I think it comes together with our annual releases of the taxonomy, documentation in our updates of elements that might have been deprecated, or perhaps a change in how one aspect has been modeled versus a similar aspect that might have been modeled previously. And I think that again links back to some degree to the modeling policies, because then again, that's something that we would almost tether to and say, well, these are the rational sort of decisions we've taken to underpin the actions that we've taken. It gives at least stakeholders and people who use our taxonomy some reference point to understand, is it the right decision? Could we be doing it differently? And as we navigate the change of the XBRL standard and then how that reflects into our taxonomy, at least what I hope to see is modeling policies evolve in that respect, and then obviously filter down through the taxonomies. So I hope I've given a reasonable answer to your question, but I will also defer to
That's
Owen.
very helpful. I'm sure helps a number of people in the audience. Did you want to add to that, Owen? Are we happy with that?
Yeah, just to say that obviously, as Jatin said, we have an annual release cycle where the taxonomy is updated. During a year, we will publish a proposal for an update to the taxonomy, or possibly several proposals driven by, is there a change to the standards? Have we got some kind of general improvements we're doing? Is there a common practice review we've done and looked at certain areas and found there's some improvements we can make to the taxonomy? So those will be published for public review. We normally give sort of a couple of months to look at those. We'll then take those back. We'll take them to a consultative group that we've got that provides quite an input on that, on which FASB is involved. And then we'll publish a final proposal for an update, and then, as Jatin said, it gets bundled together in March each year into an annual update with a whole bunch of change notes and the delta information there to help people kind of follow along during the year, see what's coming. And
You put a lot of effort into it, in other words. How about you at FASB? Do you bother?
Yeah, we just do it. You know? I mean, a lot of it's the same. You know, it's the same kind of communication.
You could largely say ditto, but
but I do want to emphasize one thing that we started doing a few years ago, and say we, David specifically, and this has really paid big dividends. So, you know, it's not uncommon for a standard setter like us. We do outreach to our constituent. You know, they're all involved. They're at the table. We're communicating constantly. But we started a few years ago doing a specific outreach to software developers. Those are largely with the filing agents. Some will probably fall outside of that space, but it's largely with the filing agents. And anytime we're making a technical tweak in the taxonomy, you know, we implement extensible enumerations, or we do something else that's more nuanced, David will blast out an email to everybody in the community. You know, and again, these are developers within the filing agents, to make sure that they're comfortable with the change that we're making. Not only comfortable, but aware, right? Because a lot of times these things just trickle down to those folks, and we want to make sure that they're learning about it, and that we're learning about their concerns right at the beginning. And that's paid big dividends.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Is there a question from the audience? Or are you just going to tackle them in the corridor? Please go ahead.
Thanks. I'm Harold from Germany. I first have one comment. I want to thank both organizations for their really stable release process and the stable artifacts they produce, and also in a timely and predictable manner. That's really important, and I really want to stress that. That's really important, and I want to applaud them for this. And second, I have a question for the IFRS taxonomy. There is this ISEF filing program, and there are translations produced for all European languages. Is there any conversations maybe to bring these translations to the IFRS taxonomy? Because I think that's where they belong, or where they would give more value, even more value to users. So that's
a great question, Harold. Any thoughts? You fancy tackling that one, Owen?
Yes, it's probably a good opportunity, I think, now the ESEF has been for a few years, to re-have that conversation. When it was initially introduced, there were some issues around the translation being done by the European Commission, not necessarily based on the IFRS standards, and so that just getting that interaction in the introductory time, when it was a bit, the timing pressure was a bit on, but I think it's now probably worth a conversation. Again.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Amy, go on. Go on, let's have one more question, please. Sorry, Kareem. Race that microphone to Amy.
So, thank you very much for today. So, the question for the IASB. Obviously, your sister board, the ISSB, has a taxonomy. Obviously, they have on their list eventually to have some connectivity to the financial statements. What does that mean for the IFRS taxonomy? How different of a structure is the sustainability taxonomy, and what are the plans to kind of bring those together?
So I should say, effectively, we wear three hats, both Jatin and I. We work for the IFRS Foundation, and the taxonomy development team is actually one of the good examples of interconnection between the boards, because we actually work to both boards, developing both taxonomies. So these design principles that we're talking about, we're trying as far as possible to make them identical across both taxonomies, to apply the same kind of approaches so that people have the best chance of being able to apply knowledge they know from the accounting to the sustainability and vice versa. Now, obviously, there's a limit to how far you can go with that because the requirements are quite different. But we do have those conversations. We do try and use those things. We say we try and learn from one and bring it back to the other and vice versa, and try and bring the two taxonomies together so that both technical preparers, software developers, all the rest of it can apply that knowledge across. As you say, as time goes on, there is likely to be more and more interconnection with the accounting. But of course, the interesting point from our perspective is that the sustainability standards are accounting standard neutral. They're supposed to work with any accounting standard. So I have this slightly strange position of building an accounting taxonomy on one hand and a sustainability taxonomy on the other in the same room. And the sustainability taxonomy has to consider that the user of it might also be using FASB for accounting, or some other, or the UK taxonomy for accounting, or some other kind of arrangement. So it's going to be interesting to develop those increasing connections, which are the areas I think which over time will develop more and more. Now, there are some ways in which connectivity between information is just one of those interesting things that we're thinking about both in sustainability accounting, and there are a couple of nice mechanisms we're considering using from XBRL. But then there are some things where you go, at some point, I may need to say in the sustainability taxonomy, I'm talking about profit, but I don't know what accounting basis it's on. And can I tie that to my accounting taxonomy? You know, the more the IFRS accounting taxonomy, sustainability taxonomies are connected tightly, the neater it will be for someone who uses both standards. But the more complicated it will be to use it with US GAAP or some other non-IFRS accounting. We got lucky in the first sustainability standards. The degree to which that was an issue was limited. It will be interesting to see how we go over the next, as that gets more. Let's just say it's one of those things that I'm still looking for some really good answers as to how to get the best of both worlds, and it's likely to be the subject of quite a few consultations and discussions over time.
And on that note, can I echo what Harold said? I think we as a digital reporting community, but the global information industry and the world of users and preparers of financial and sustainability information are incredibly lucky to have these folk work so hard, to take their efforts so seriously, to have the very strong and increasing support and even integration of their boards. And we're very grateful for their time and coming together with us today. Please do tackle them in the corridors later on with your other questions. But please join with me in thanking our panel today for their presentation and discussion.